Associate Professor of Arabic and Arab Culture and the Director of the Arabic Program at the University of South Carolina. Professor Sheehi's latest book is Islamophobia, the Ideological Campaign Against Muslims. In the following interview, he distinguishes between the extreme types of Islamophobia promulgated by a few right-wing organizations and the more pervasive form of Islamophobia found in the mainstream of public discourse.
And I'm joined by Stephen Sheehi. Welcome to Alternate Focus.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. My first question is, you have a book coming out about Islamophobia. How did you get interested in Islamophobia?
It's a good question. You know, I grew up as Arab American, obviously subjected to run-of-the-mill anti-Arab prejudices and stereotypes. And I realized in the 1990s that things were slowly shifting in terms of the way that prejudice was being framed and presented. And it was moving away from just a generic Arab stereotype of the Muslim sheikh or the Palestinian terrorist to something more religion-specific and region-specific. So I started to marry those old Arab stereotypes with new sort of religious overtones.
And you say that this current type of Islamophobia started around the Cold War. Talk about what shifted then and how it changed, what form it takes.
Well, I think I use as almost an arbitrary watershed Gulf War One. Depends which Gulf. What perspective you're talking about, but from the United States perspective, it's Gulf War One. Where the Soviet Union had pretty much disintegrated and the United States had come to the forefront. The world had become, in other words, a unipolar power. There was no longer two superpowers, there was one. And so within the 1990s, after this sort of shift, the fall of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, the United States started to articulate new discourses of Islamophobia, new rhetorics of Islamophobia to justify their presence now militarily and economically all over the world, but in particular North Africa, the Middle East, South Asia.
You start the current phase of Islamophobia, the current type of Islamophobia, somewhere around the Cold War, Gulf War era. Why do you pick that moment?
Right. It's in the beginning of the 1990s that United States shifts from the Cold War to becoming the preeminent superpower in a unipolar globe. And so the United States was no longer challenged or checked by another bloc, the Soviet bloc. So they needed to, or I don't want to say they needed because it's not some sort of concerted effort within, the 100th floor of the Empire State Building, but discourses on Islamophobia, rhetoric about Islamophobia starts to become articulated in the 1990s, particularly targeting Muslims, and it's there to justify the United States' interests in the Middle East, in North Africa, even in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia and Central Asia.
And then when you talk about Islamophobia, what exactly are you saying? Is it people going out on the streets and painting signs on mosques, or is it something different than that?
Right. Islamophobia means a lot. And not necessarily a lot of different things, but a lot. And definitely there are differences between Islamophobia, for example, in the United States, and Islamophobia in Europe. I think there are two different pedigrees ideologically. The Islamophobia that I concentrate on in the United States is to put it simply, a hate or a fear of Muslims, and an understanding that Muslims are fundamentally different than other people, than white America, than Westerners, whatever. So Islamophobia is a hate of Muslims based on cultural, social, and religious criterion.
And what effect does that have? What are the actual impacts on Muslims in America?
Well, this is the thing. I mean, the impact is multi-level. right? On the run of the day level, you have just Muslims being subjected to mild to extremely violent hate acts, whether they're speech acts, being called names, whether it's job discrimination, whether there are issues about, whether a Muslim girl can play soccer or be a waitress, or whether because she might be wearing a hijab, a headscarf, declaring, the qatra, not allowed because it's not part of dress codes, these sorts of things. Bullying in schools, harassment, being called racist names. I mean, those are sort of unpleasant daily, manifestations of Islamophobia that most Muslims would come across. Sometimes it gets more violent than that. There have been innumerable, especially over the past couple of years, mosque arson attacks, gas attacks in Ohio, vandalism, families have been terrorized, bricks through windows, notes on cars saying get out. So on the daily level, on the ground level, there just is a plethora of just, simple violent acts that people are subjected to, being beat up. I mean, lots of this. I think on a more dangerous level, Islamophobia is manifested in state policy, and whether at the federal level or at the level of the city and the state. Islamophobia is used as a tool or a foil to implement a lot of policies that would otherwise be unacceptable, policies that violate people's civil rights. In this case, they're targeted at Muslim Americans.
Talk about some of those policies. Like, what are the ones that stand out for you?
Well, the one that stands out the most, that's most recent, is a law that was passed by Congress called the National Defense Authorization Act. And it was a bipartisan law presented by John McCain and Carl Levin of Michigan. And it's a law that legalizes a lot of the policies that the Obama administration had continued regarding the illegal detention of terrorist suspects. Those policies were started by the Bush administration, and then regularized and institutionalized by the Obama administration, who's very deliberate. I mean, they're very. President Obama is a very intelligent man. He's a constitutional lawyer. And what he did is he really took these Bush policies and regularized them in such a way that could make them legal. Now, with the Defense Authorization Bill, for example, he signed on to that and endorsed it. And what that bill does, for example, is it says that the United States government can arrest anyone in the world, whether they're an American citizen or a non-American citizen, or if they're a suspect of being a terrorist and have an intent to harm the United States, or, and this is more, I think, insidious, if they are suspected in supporting terrorism or a terrorist organization. And that's, you say, okay, fine, that's normal, right? But the bill says that that defendant who's arrested and accused of that, it can be put in jail without any charges indefinitely, forever. The state does not have to produce evidence. The evidence can be secret evidence. In the United States, it's a very dangerous thing, because not only does it target American citizens and completely nullify habeas corpus, where the government has to produce evidence to charge you, and in fact has to charge you for a crime, and this makes it so you don't even have to be charged with a crime, but also you're remanded to the military. So if a civilian police force, for example, picks you up, suspects you of terrorism, they hand you to the military in the United States, and then you're detained indefinitely and can be there until you rot. So that's, I mean, and that law is predicated on the fact that there's something called a Muslim threat, a threat from Islamic terrorists. So, I mean, they're not talking about, KKK threats. They're not talking about, this is specifically intended to fight the war on terror.
And what would you say to people who would argue, look, we're focused on Muslims because we were attacked by Muslims?
Right.
I mean, that's a common argument you hear. How do you respond to that?
It's a very prevalent or argument, and I think one thing we have to say is that there's no reason for re-engineering civil liberties in this country. That number two is that any violent act committed against the United States or against Americans is a criminal act, and therefore it should be subject to criminal prosecution in the due process by which the Constitution affords. We all know that Muslims are a huge and diverse community. There is no such thing as an American community of Muslims or a Muslim American community. I mean, they're so diverse. There are black Muslims, there are Pakistani Muslims, there are Arab American Muslims, there are within those Arab American Muslims, there are Palestinians. So we have so many. There are converts, there are poor Muslims, there are well-off Muslims. So what happens is that to equate acts, political acts done by Muslims, who happen to be Muslims, in the name of their religion, to Muslims in general is a racist act. It's a jump, right? So, I mean, obviously, we don't hate white people because Jeffrey Dahmer was white, and that's what if you look at terrorist acts before 9/11, one of the biggest one was Oklahoma bombing. So Timothy McVeigh, not all white people have to be investigated because Timothy McVeigh was a white supremacist. So that's the thing. I mean, whether or not the perpetrators of 9/11 were Muslim is almost irrelevant. That they use religion in a politicized manner is relevant, but that should not be a pretense for profiling a whole religion.
Now, you focus a lot of your research on Bernard Lewis and Fareed Zakaria. Why do you pick them, and how do they exemplify Islamophobia in your view?
Right, it's a good question. You asked me about the 1990s. In the 1990s, people like Bernard Lewis and later Fareed Zakaria would serve to give language to a lot of scattered Islamophobic tenets. Okay, I don't want to overvalue Bernard Lewis, or Fareed Zakaria, who's very savvy. For Fareed Zakaria, he's very smart and very savvy. So you can see how he shifts his language now from say 2001. But he regularized is sort of discourses and rhetorics of Islamophobia. There's more than one form of Islamophobia, right? There's this sort of really hardcore, all Muslims are this and all Muslims are that and they're bad and Islam is a religion of the devil and all this sort of nonsense. And then there's the softer core Islamophobia, which I think most of mainstream America suffers from, which is just prejudice against Muslims, the idea that somehow Muslims are different from us. Fareed Zakaria, for example, even though he's a Muslim, perpetuates that. He predicates his analysis on the fact that Muslim communities or Muslim countries in the Middle East didn't modernize in certain ways. So he sort of regularizes a certain sort of rhetoric of what I call soft Islamophobia, as opposed to Bernard Lewis, who's a much more, gives language and a narrative to the neocons, sort of Vulcan language of war against the Muslim world in the war and terror.
Do you have any examples from things they've written or said that sort of exemplify what you're talking about there?
Yeah, I mean, the pivotal piece for Bernard Lewis was a book, an article on the origins of Muslim rage, for example. And what he does is that he locates Arab discontent and Muslim discontent in their culture, right? Instead of saying these are the political reasons why the Middle East is a mess and why people in the Middle East are angry, rather than saying these are the historical conditions, what he'll say is Muslims are sexually frustrated. They repress their women. Their fathers are mean to them. So he sets out all these. He grabs actually all these sorts of Islamophobic tenets which are already out there, and nicely weaves them into this sort of neat narrative that places what's wrong with Islam inside Muslims themselves. Right? He makes it a cultural issue. So he does that in this origins of Muslim rage, which is a big hit with Cheney. He's always quoting it.
Are there ways that it sounds like that there are ways that regular Americans could be Islamophobic in a way they might not realize it?
Right.
Can you talk about something where someone might have a certain view that they think is just based on values and
right.
but really has a subtle Islamophobia behind it?
Well, this is the problem with racism in the United States, right? It's so ingrained and it's so hard for us to see beyond our own blinders. So, in regards to Islamophobia and Muslim Americans vis-a-vis the mainstream, it's just that, for example, that precept right there, that equation right there. We call them Muslim Americans as if somehow that differentiates them from other Americans. The concept of, for example, tolerance, where you have a lot of good Americans who say, well, I like them. They're good people, and we have Muslim friends, and so there's always a sense of they are good, they are like us, or they're fine, even though they're not like us. I mean, that right there is a clue to somehow how we see them as not us. It's tough because, so for example, there's this horrible show which is called. I think it's called American Muslim, the American Muslim Family. This reality show.
Yeah, I haven't seen it yet.
It's the whole premise of the film of this series, this reality show, is that look, they're just like us. I mean, if you have that about black people, it's offensive, or about Latinos, it's offensive, and maybe it took the civil rights movement, whatever, but I mean, to sort of get us to that point. But we should know by now that we shouldn't predicate a difference of other people just on their religion or skin color or where they're from.
What effect do you think that sort of way of thinking has effect? What effect does that have upon Muslims themselves, like on an individual level?
I mean, I think this country over the past 10 years has largely established a culture of fear. I think American Muslims are generally afraid. They're afraid of authorities. I mean, because they have a long track record of cooperating with authorities, but still being targeted, right? So, for example, in Orange County, there's a famous story about, case about FBI putting in spies and agents to provoke people in this mosque. When this guy ends up talking a lot of crazy stuff about bombing America and all this stuff, this mosque goes to the Muslim American community organization, CARE, based in Los Angeles, who has relations with the FBI. Okay, so they do what the imam of the mosque goes to CARE and says, "We got this guy. He's a nut job," right? And so CARE does what they're supposed to do. They have relations with the FBI. They call up the FBI and say, in this mosque in Tustin, this guy's crazy and he's talking smack. I think he's dangerous. It happens to be their man. Okay? What happens is that instead of pulling that guy out, they go and get some other people, snag some people from that mosque, and threaten them to see if they will become informants. And if they don't want to become informants, they say they're going to deport them or charge them with terrorism or support of a terrorist organization. In the case I'm talking about, the guy's brother-in-law was Taliban in Afghanistan. But everyone is Taliban, knows some Taliban in Afghanistan, you know what I mean? I mean, it's like in the South, everybody knows someone who probably was a racist at one time, or, it's just an unfortunate truth, So, it doesn't make that person a racist, right? It doesn't. I live in South Carolina. It doesn't make those people racist. It just happens, just like the guy in Afghanistan who his brother-in-law might have been and that's might. And so, thankfully, that guy ended up okay. But what happened is that you have someone who's cooperating. You have a mosque who's cooperating. They do what they're supposed to do. And the FBI then comes around and still not only spies on you, then also tries to coerce. So where do you turn if you're a Muslim American? What do? You live in a culture of fear. Who do you trust? Who do you trust if the NYPD is spying on you at school, in the university? If you're just going to go on a mosque, an outing, rafting with your friends from the Muslim Studies Association. I mean, where do you turn? So in this respect, as a Muslim American, it's pretty tough because you really don't know what you can say, to whom you can say it, without being suspect.
What's sort of the take-home message for Americans? What do you want if they read this book? What do you want them to take away from this book?
I want to start having folks interrogate their own prejudices, their own what we call subject position. People ask me, well, you're saying that you're upset if people hate Muslims, but on the other hand, if people are trying to be really tolerant with Muslims and saying it's okay what you're criticizing them. Well, what should we do? And I think what we need to do, and hopefully this could kind of be the take home, is to stop asking questions about us and them. Is to start to understand phenomenon politically. Why do things happen politically? Why do things happen economically? What are the relationships between our prejudices and our privileges? What is the relationship between our prejudices and legislation that we would not have accepted 20 years ago? Why is it that I understand someone as different from us, where I really know that if they had a different skin color, I wouldn't be asking that question, and because I see them as different, it allows me to buy into so much other stuff. Buy into the fact that, well, maybe, we need to be careful because, Al-Qaeda wants to bring the United States down, or we need to support Israel because they're against our same enemy, or because we need to have nuclear energy because we need to get independent from Middle East oil. Right? So we can see how ingrained those notions are, those racist notions. So when we stop seeing the world in them and us, and start to understand things politically and economically, then we can, I think, get at answers better. So, I think it's really important, for example, to recognize the Islamophobia, how it parallels other forms of racism, right? It parallels racism against black people. It certainly parallels racism against Latinos, especially in this day of anti-immigrant sentiment. And quite frankly, Islamophobia is a terrible thing, but it can tell us about something that's far more dangerous and far more widespread, which is racism against Latino community and this sort of vilification of this community in the United States. So I mean, those mechanisms are very similar. Again, what you want to say is the mechanisms are very similar. What are the implications of each one? Who's benefiting from each one? What are the politics of each one?
And then finally, if we continue along the status quo, what is it going to look like in the future?
I think I do not foresee, number one, the eradication of Islamophobia in the near future. It is a convenient foil for lazy political operatives to deploy whenever they need it. So based on the fact that I don't think Islamophobia is going anywhere, I fear that it will be further used to erode civil liberties in the United States, and it will be further used to justify American foreign policy in the Middle East. It will be used to, for example, invade or bomb Iran. It will be used to stay in Afghanistan. It will be used to continue intervention in African countries, which we have many bases and operations that we really don't talk of. So I'm afraid that Islamophobia is not going anywhere. But if we don't start to again question that, I'm afraid it's just going to be more of the same, and which is going to result in more antagonism against the United States.